In August 586 BC, the massive invading army of King Nebuchadnezzar reduced the ancient city of Jerusalem to smoking rubble. The Babylonians burned the Great Temple to the ground, leveled the city infrastructure, and force-marched the surviving population into exile. This total collapse didn't happen overnight. It was the brutal conclusion to an 18-month siege that methodically starved the city's inhabitants. In July of that year, the invading forces finally breached the massive stone defenses. To the ancient mind, these walls were physically impenetrable. For the survivors, this was a moment of sudden, incomprehensible abandonment. Yet the sequence of events leading to this collapse had been detailed 4 years earlier. If we look at this timeline and rewind the clock exactly 4 years to 593 BC, we find the prophet Ezekiel in a very different setting. At this point, Ezekiel is already living in exile among the Babylonians, hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. There, God gives Ezekiel a highly specific, physically bizarre set of instructions to perform in the middle of public view. He is commanded to execute an acted parable. Instead of preaching with words, Ezekiel is told to become a piece of living, physical performance art. The instructions recorded in the 4th chapter of Ezekiel, verses 1 through 8, form a precise spatial and temporal blueprint. They map out the mechanics of the coming 586 BC siege alongside centuries of geopolitical history. This sequence of actions suggests that the destruction of the city was documented and communicated well before the first Babylonian battering ram arrived. The demonstration begins in Ezekiel 4, verse 1. The prophet is instructed to take a clay tile, a common writing brick, and physically portray the city of Jerusalem upon it. In verse 2, the instructions escalate. Ezekiel has to build miniature siege works around his clay city, an enemy camp, a fort, an earth mound, and battering rams. This physical model maps to the reality of ancient warfare. Historical reliefs from the region show exactly these tactics, soldiers scaling earth mounds alongside massive wheeled battering rams. 4 years after Ezekiel built this model, this exact military formation would surround the real Jerusalem in January 588 BC. Picture the ancient scene. A prophet lying in the dirt next to a miniature war zone, drawing the confusion and questions of passing exiles. Then comes verse 3. The Lord commands Ezekiel to take an iron pan and set it upright, perfectly bisecting the space between himself and the besieged city model. The placement of this pan turned the model into a prison, signaling a blockade that was physically absolute. This iron plate functioned as a literal barrier, cutting the city off from its only source of protection and signaling a withdrawal of divine favor. By placing the iron wall in the dirt, Ezekiel shows the observers that Jerusalem is now isolated, separated from the Lord. Systemic, unrepentant rebellion eventually crystallizes into this type of impenetrable barrier, where God becomes a silent observer of inevitable judgment. After establishing the physical layout of the siege, the text shifts to Ezekiel's bodily posture in verses 4 and 5. The Lord commands Ezekiel to lie strictly on his left side for exactly 390 days. Look at this diagram showing the historical timeline. The text establishes a specific ratio. I have appointed thee each day for a year. Under this logic, Ezekiel's 390-day vigil tracks nearly 4 centuries of history. This specific number is assigned to the House of Israel, referring strictly to the 10 northern tribes. Tracing 390 years backward from Ezekiel's era lands directly at 931 BC, the year the kingdom divided. That division marked the beginning of a state-sponsored system of idolatry, starting with the setup of golden calves under Jeroboam. The historical record confirms that this timeline of rebellion had already culminated in destruction and conquest by Assyria in 722 BC. The specific posture carries meaning. In ancient Hebrew imagery, the left side denotes disfavor. It also carries a secondary symbolism representing the past. Israel's judgment is temporally behind them. Their population is already scattered across the Assyrian Empire. God's justice is shown here as mathematically precise, tracking the exact duration of a culture's systemic rebellion over centuries. Verse 6 introduces a pivot. After the 390 days are completed, Ezekiel is commanded to physically turn over and lie on his right side. He must hold this new posture for exactly 40 days, representing a distinct 40-year period. This second number is assigned exclusively to the house of Judah, the southern kingdom. By using these two different numbers, the text shows God treating Israel and Judah as entirely distinct legal entities, each with separate track records of rebellion. The right side signifies a place of honor. Judah's rebellion, while ultimately fatal to their nation, was significantly shorter than Israel's. The right side also points forward. Unlike the northern kingdom, Judah's ultimate judgment is still actively unfolding with Babylon. If we anchor the end of this 40-year period to the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC and calculate backward, the timeline starts precisely at 627 BC. In the biblical record, 627 BC is the 13th year of King Josiah. It is the exact year the prophet Jeremiah began his ministry. Jeremiah served as the final 40-year warning to Judah, preaching right up until the exact moment the walls of Jerusalem were breached. Then, in verse 8, God tells Ezekiel he will lay bands, or ropes, upon him, so he cannot turn or break posture until the days of the siege are ended. These bands represent the point of no return. Once the designated timeline of warming expires, the duration and severity of the judgment are locked in. Here is the complete model. Ezekiel 4, verses 1 through 8, integrates space, time, and theology into a single physical demonstration. While Ezekiel lay silently in the dirt presenting this data, the people of Judah continued to believe their city was invincible. When January 588 BC arrived, the theoretical diorama became a reality on the ground in Jerusalem. The Babylonian battering rams arrived exactly as Ezekiel modeled them, and Jeremiah's 40-year warning period ended exactly as calculated. These signs functioned as legal indictments, using specific historical durations to quantify the nation's rebellion. The strict division between Israel's 390 years and Judah's 40 years shows that God evaluates collective morality with individualized precision, which brings us back to the iron pan resting in the dirt. The biblical record indicates God provided a window for repentance, like Jeremiah's 40 years, but that window had a strict expiration date. The acted parable of Ezekiel 4 suggests that when a culture builds a long enough timeline of rebellion, the iron pan will eventually drop.